a shepherd tells a story of a strange experience that he was having with one of his sheep. As he's tending the fold, he notices one morning that one particular sheep is missing. And so as the faithful shepherd that he is, he begins to search and to seek out this sheep until finally, strangely, he finds it standing perfectly without moving, calm, collected, still, and staring right back at him, but on the other side of the fence. Scratches his head, can't really understand how the sheep made it to the other side, knowing this was a full-grown adult sheep, and how it managed to jump over or perhaps go under this barbed wire fence. But he brings it back in anyways. The next morning he wakes up again, and again he finds that same sheep missing. And he finds it standing and staring right back at him in the same place, at the same spot on the other side of the fence. He's still baffled. He can't understand how it's made it to the other side. And why it hasn't ran away for that matter. It's just standing there, calm, still. And again, like the good and faithful shepherd he is, he takes it and he walks it back inside the fold and continues to assure it that there's just as good pasture to be eaten on the inside of the fold as there is on the outside. There's plenty of good eats in here. And so finally, the next day, he wakes up even earlier just to see if he can catch this mischievous sheep in action, and he does. He gets up earlier, and he notices the sheep begin to stray, and it walks to the same spot that it was standing on the other side of the fence, and it begins to work tirelessly, laboriously, to try to dig its way and kind of slither under like a snake to the other side of the fence. It is toiling. It's working extremely hard. It is exerting a tremendous amount of effort just to get to the other side, barely, even risking hurting and injuring itself through the barbed wire. And what's interesting is that it took far more effort for this sheep to snake its way under the few inches of barbed wire in the ground than it did to simply and humbly integrate itself into the flock. For days, the sheep continued to do the same thing. And interestingly, it never ran away. It just stood there, calmly, gently, peacefully, staring at him from the other side of the fence. It loved to crawl under the fence and just stand there, always near the sheepfold, but never in the sheepfold. And I think this story poignantly illustrates the spiritual reality that Jesus soberingly spells out for his disciples, the religious leaders, and all the Jews that are listening nearby in this famous passage in John 10 about the relationship between the good shepherd and his sheep. And put simply, that reality is this: not everyone born of Israel and of Jewish descent is a sheep, is his sheep. Not every religious person is a part of his fold. Not every person is a part of his fold. It doesn't matter how religious you are. It doesn't matter how wealthy you are. It doesn't matter how powerful you are. It doesn't matter how influential you are. It doesn't matter how famous you are. It doesn't matter how poor you are. It doesn't matter how lowly you are. It doesn't even matter how good you are. None of these things are marks of a true sheep of the true shepherd. No, there is a single criterion and test that all the biblical marks and traits and characteristics of a sheep, a true believer, it can be reduced to, and it is this. If you are truly a sheep, and if you are truly a sheep that truly belongs to the true fold of Jesus Christ and not another fold, then you will know his voice, listen to his voice, and obey his voice and his voice alone, following him alone, not any other supposed shepherd. You don't recognize their voice. You don't listen to their voice. You don't follow their voice. You follow the voice, the commands of, the words of Jesus Christ alone. And he will not only take you by the hand and lead you into greener pastures in this life, but into a far more abundant life than you could ever imagine. Eternity with him in his kingdom forever. Eternal life, because he is the good shepherd. And that's part of what we're going to see as we unpack this long chapter in which John, through the lips and illustrations of Jesus, unfolds something of the relationship between him and his sheep. And by way of review, in case some are unfamiliar where we're at in the life and ministry and teaching and death and resurrection of Jesus according to John's gospel, in the previous chapter, Jesus had just healed a man born blind. A man born blind, which the man himself says in verse 32, never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. This is a miracle that is unprecedented and unparalleled to this point, John tells us, in human history. This has never happened before. But the Pharisees, the religious leaders, the Jews, as John less than affectionately calls them in his gospel, referring to Jesus' opponents who dog his steps at every turn and at every point and seek a pretext to arrest and seize and kill him, they don't believe this miracle happened because they don't believe in Jesus. And so they begin to question the man first, and then his parents, and then they come back to the man. But then the man boldly, in his witness and testimony to what Jesus of Nazareth, this great prophet, had done for him, he doubles down on his initial story, and he uses quick wit and a kind of sardonic sarcasm, leaving the Pharisees without any answer or response. There's nothing left for them to say or do, but to do that which they had already made a policy of. De facto, they cast him out of the synagogue, as they've been doing to anyone who comes remotely close to confessing Jesus as the Christ that John tells us in verse 22. They cast him out like yesterday's trash. But to Jesus, this man is not a castaway. He's not a cast out. He's a lost sheep, and like the good shepherd that he is, he goes and searches for and seeks out this sheep. You see that in verse 35, and he takes him by the hand, as it were, and begins to add to his revelation or add to his faith and understanding at this point by giving to him new revelation, knowing the man's faith as of yet is insufficient. He hasn't yet understood and realized Jesus as the object of his faith, as his Messiah, as his Savior. And so Jesus takes him like the lost sheep by the hands, and he leads him in a line of questioning. Verse 36, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he answers, yes, sir. Show me where he is. Point him out to me, and I will believe in him. And Jesus responds, verse 37, you're looking at him. It's me. I am he. And then the man responds, this time not with sir, but he confesses him as Lord, I believe. And then he bows down in worship, signifying that his faith has now come full circle and has been made perfect and complete as it finds its object. Not only are his physical eyes opened by Jesus now, but his spiritual eyes. his sight comes full circle and is made complete as it focuses on the person of Jesus Christ, the eternal Son of God. And he worships him. But the rest don't. The Pharisees and the Jews still don't believe. They refuse to believe, and so Jesus pronounces intense indictment, judgment on them, saying, this is the reason for which I came, not just to save, yes, primarily, John 3:15-16, but also to judge. I came to judge. And he begins to lead out the paradox of belief here, which he says that I came that those who do not see may see. Those who do not see are those who realize that they are dead in their lostness, in their darkness, in their blindness to sin, and are in desperate need of external illumination in the form of the true light, the light that was coming into the world, Jesus Christ himself, to open the blinders. And on the other hand, those who see are blind, may become blind, he says. Those are the Pharisees, the religious leaders, those who think they see and understand, think they know God's sovereign plan and outworking of redemption, think they have the right interpretation of the Old Testament law, but by their own proudness and puffing themselves up in knowledge, thinking that they see and know the truth, that is the very evidence that they are indeed still in darkness, blindness, deadness, and sin, is what he's saying. That's the Pharisees, the religious leaders, and all the people who continue to reject Jesus' witness, his testimony, his message, his person. And he says in verse 41, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But since you say you see, you think you see, your guilt remains. He's saying if you were actually blind, if you realized your own total depravity, blindness, and darkness, and your need for external revelation, illumination, salvation that God is providing for you in his Son, you would have no guilt. My judgment would not rest on you, but since you still insist and think that you see and you know the truth, you stand guilty. Guilty before God and guilty before the one whom God has appointed as supreme judge. He's been saying that in John chapter 5. The Father has given all judgment into my hand, all authority. You are guilty. It's not me who's on trial here. It's you. It's you. And it's in this setting that John now moves to tell a story in which he continues to lead out these themes here of belief and unbelief, seeing and not seeing, who Jesus' sheep are and who are not his sheep. And he does this using an everyday analogy, an everyday illustration that the listeners and the Pharisees standing nearby and everyone else in that first century Palestinian context would have well understood by talking about the relationship of a shepherd and his sheep. Verse 1, truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. Truly, truly, this is a common solemn formula that Jesus uses for double emphasis when he's about to make a pronouncement of particular importance that he wants his listeners, and you and I by extension, to pay ever so close attention to. This is the 15th time he's used it in John's gospel, and he's going to use it again in just a few verses. He says, truly, truly, pay close attention here. I'm going to give to you an illustration. An illustration, a figure of speech from everyday life that you all should understand. And he begins to do that. If somebody tries to enter the sheepfold, the pen, the corral, by any other place than the front door, seeking to climb over its walls, that man is a thief and a robber. This is an illustration. This is actually what John's going to call in verse 6 for us. If you drop down to that, he's going to call it a figure of speech. A figure of speech. What is that? The word behind there is paroimia in the Greek. Figure of speech. Interesting. Kind of like an illustration. We know that Jesus in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, love to speak in parables, right? Those enigmatic sayings that Jesus had that always had an underlying meaning or perhaps multiple meanings in certain instances. This is a different word. That's parabole. This is paroimia. Different words. But both words were used to translate the same equivalent word in Hebrew, mashal. And these words could refer to a variety of different literary devices, metaphors, similes, analogies, figures of speech, illustrations, stories, and yes, even parables proper. And though they differed a lot in meaning depending on the setting and the context and the usage, they all overlapped and shared the common thread that there was always some underlying meaning or moral or lesson or truth that they sought to teach. But this is not a parable, properly speaking, like in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John actually doesn't use any parables in his gospel. We know that the synoptics use a lot of them. And though this is not a parable proper, it is simply a figure of speech and kind of like it, it is similar yet to a lot of the parables that Jesus used. It's called the parables of normalcy. The parables that he used that were intentionally used by him that they would understand everyday life metaphors that would show everyday life situations and the unique and specific responses of the characters within those life situations. Parables of normalcy. Like, you fast at a funeral. You don't fast at a wedding, right? You put new wine in new wineskins. That's normal. A doctor doesn't go to heal those who are well. He goes to heal those who are sick. That's normal. And yet even more close to the imagery at hand in chapter 10, shepherds. Even a man, if his sheep falls into the ditch on the Sabbath, even he normally will pick up that sheep out of the ditch in the Sabbath. Or a shepherd, if one of his 100 sheep are lost and goes astray, normally he would leave the 99 and go seek it out. These are parables of normalcy, and in the same way, this is a figure of speech, a saying, an illustration, if you will, a story from everyday life that they would have well understood, or at the very least should have well understood. And we'll see in a few verses that they don't. But in this case, it's about sheep. It's about sheep, and specifically sheep herding. And the first thing that he wants them to understand in this figure of speech is that if anyone seeks to enter the sheepfold, but by any way other than the door, the gate, that man, that person is a thief and a robber. And that's kind of axiomatic, isn't it? That's basic to say. Of course, if someone who's attempting to enter the sheepfold, not in the proper manner when there is a door and a gate that simply must be open to them if they are authorized and have access and can enter, and the gatekeeper or the doorkeeper, who's kind of an under-shepherd, would simply open the door as they recognize the shepherd. But if you have to resort to scaling the walls covertly, perhaps under cover by night, it's very clear that you have malicious intentions and motivation. You must be either a thief or a robber. Just like today, if you see somebody attempting to enter into someone's home through a window rather than the front door, you can be sure that that person is up to no good, right? And it's the same thing here. You say, why does he say thief and robber? Those are synonyms in English. Indeed, they are. In the Greek, they're two different words. Kleptos, thief, and leptes, insurrectionist, actually. Slightly different meaning depending on the context. But I don't think Jesus here has that in mind necessarily. He's simply trying to emphasize that the only people who are going to try to scale the wall of a sheepfold, a sheep pen, are thieves and robbers, burglars, murderers, insurrectionists, those who are up to no good, those who want to hurt the sheep. That's what he's saying here. A thief and a robber. On the other hand, verse 2, he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice. He calls them out by name and leads them out. And here you see at least three different contrasts between the thieves and robbers, those who have malicious motives, and the shepherd. They are diametrically opposed here. Number one, the shepherd enters through the door. He comes through the front door, the gate, the entrance, the manner in which he's supposed to enter the sheepfold. And number two, notice verse 3, the gatekeeper opens, the doorkeeper. I know those words are used interchangeably. Door, gatekeeper, same thing. The doorkeeper opens for him. Why? He recognizes him. He knows that he is the shepherd of the sheep, and he is authorized to enter in and to tend to them. And number three, the shepherd calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And if he calls them by name, it means they recognize his voice. They recognize his presence. The contrast couldn't be more complete between a real shepherd and a kind of imposter shepherd who has malicious motives and is bent on hurting the sheep. In this ancient Near Eastern Palestinian context, families typically had a few sheep, but they didn't have more than a few sheep. And so you can kind of visualize it in a village here. This is not open country setting. This is in a village. The word for sheepfold, or whatever word you have in your translation, is actually courtyard. And so the idea was you'd have a bunch of small family homes on the outside, and on the inside it'd be a courtyard. Courtyard is just a space, an open space that has open sky and faces up. And so the homes and their back walls would be adjacent, forming a kind of square or a rectangle. It'd be an open area in the middle, a shared space, if you will, a courtyard. And because all the families could only afford to have a few sheep, they would all be keeping their sheep in the same courtyard, that shared space. And because they all only had a few sheep, they would each not have need for their own separate shepherd. There'd typically be one shepherd, perhaps a son from one of those families that had a home adjacent to the courtyard, or two daughters. And if there was no sons or daughters to tend the sheep, then they would hire someone, a hireling on the outside. They would employ him to shepherd all these sheep. That's the setting. That was common. That was normal. And all the sheep would recognize the shepherd easily. They would know. They would be able to distinguish between an imposter. And so the real shepherd comes in through the front gate. The sheep recognize his voice. The gatekeeper lets him in. And notice, verse 3, he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. He calls them by name. This speaks to an intimate knowledge here. It's a mutual knowledge. It's not now that just the sheep know him and recognize his voice, which they do. It's that he knows them by name. Because if he knows them by name, the implication is that he's named them. There's something special going on here. It was not normal, by the way, in this first century Palestinian context. Shepherds did not know their sheep by name. So you see where this is going now. You know this is a story. It's a figure of speech. It's an illustration, but he knows them by name. And notice, He calls his own sheep by name. Verse 3, the other implication is that not all the sheep in that fold, in that courtyard, belong to him. He calls his own. Because there probably is other sheep there that are not of his fold. He calls his own by name. And they respond to his call. They know his voice. It's a comfort to them. It's soothing to them. It's safety for them. They know when he comes calling and the gatekeeper opens the door, they can now go outside and find green pasture and eat and nourish themselves. And they're safe in his presence. And that's what he does. He calls them by name, and then he leads them out one by one. He goes before them. You can't see this here. That word translated leads out is the same word that's translated just a few verses earlier for what the Pharisees do to the man born blind. They cast him out. They cast him out, and Jesus leads them out. What a difference in shepherding imagery here. And so you can see already at least one of the meanings in this illustration is intended to contrast two different kinds of shepherds. A shepherd who leads his sheep, and shepherds who violently, maliciously drive them out, like the Pharisees who drove out this man born blind. They drove him out. In the West, shepherds typically have dogs or goads to move and maneuver and to push and to shepherd their sheep, to steer them and guide them where they want them to go. A little more aggressive. It's more violent. And in this setting, in the ancient Near East, they didn't do that. They just used their voice. They used their voice. And the shepherds would recognize their voice and follow the sound of their voice wherever that voice led them. It was common for them to stand outside of the sheepfold, and they'd all have their own unique, peculiar calls, whether with their voice or perhaps with a trumpet, a shofar, and the sheep would recognize their voice. The sheep know the shepherd's voice, which is to say they know him. And the shepherd, by extension, knows his sheep because he names them. He names them. And look at verse 4. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. This is just a restatement of what he's already said, emphasizing the difference between this kind of a shepherd who brings out, notice again, all his own, not all the sheep, only those that belong to him. He goes before them, meaning in front of them. He doesn't violently drive and poke and prod and push them against their will. They follow him willingly, in full faith, in full trust, in full confidence that they are in good hands. They follow him. He brings them out to pasture. Why? Well, why do they follow him? Again, the end of verse 4. For they know his voice. His voice is safety. His voice is security. His voice is protection. His voice is provision. He is all they know, and he is all they need. They follow him. They don't just follow any voice. They follow the voice that they know, and the voice that knows them. It's a mutual knowing. Hearing here is almost synonymous with knowing. Knowing is the result of hearing, but it's also the result of being known. They know him because he first knew them. He named them, kind of like John says elsewhere, isn't it? And so they follow his voice. But they don't just follow any voice. No, they won't. Verse 5, a stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. John doesn't identify for us the identity of this stranger, but it's pretty clear from this story that the stranger in mind here can be none other but the thief or the robber. Right? The one who has ill, malicious intent towards them. They don't follow a stranger. In fact, they run away from his very presence is the whole point. They don't recognize him. He comes in and jumps over the wall. They don't know who he is. He's not their shepherd, and they don't recognize his voice. And so what do? In fear, they turn and run away. They flee from him. They don't know the voice of strangers. This is foreign to them. This is danger. This is warning. This is not safe. They're not just going to follow anyone. No. And then look at verse 6. This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. And so instead, you might expect at this point, as Jesus is telling the story, the good shepherd, the shepherd, comes into the sheepfold. He goes in through the gate. He brings them out to pasture, and he's leading them ahead of them here. You might expect the story to continue where Jesus is going to tell them what he's going to do with them next, but he kind of suddenly, abruptly, out of nowhere, interrupts or stops the story completely. And then John, the evangelist, gives us this parenthetical note to tell us that this is indeed a figure of speech, a paroimia, that they do not understand at all. They don't understand it. It's a figure of speech. And though it is not quite like exactly one-to-one correspondence to a parable, the net result is not unlike that of Jesus' parables, where the people don't understand it, but unlike in those instances where Jesus would tell parables publicly in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then he'd give the private explanation to his disciples, there's no such explanation here. It just says that they didn't get it. They did not understand. And there's an irony here that you and I are beginning to see, but unfortunately, it is falling on deaf ears and blind eyes to those who are present. And it is the reality that his sheep know him and they know his voice. But those who are not his sheep don't know him and don't know his voice, which is to say, don't understand. And who are they that don't understand that Jesus is speaking to? The Pharisees, the religious leaders. This is another object illustration meant to show them now not only their own blindness, which Jesus has shown a chapter earlier when he gave sight to the man born blind, and then the paradox of unbelief, because you think you see, you don't. Not only do they not see spiritually, but they are deaf spiritually. They don't understand. They can't hear the words that Jesus is saying to them. They can't. At all. And so instead of explaining the illustration, the figure of speech, Jesus isn't going to do that. He goes on to say something completely different, almost changing gears. Borrowing some key concepts and themes from the illustration, yes, but now adding a completely different layer of meaning to them altogether. Look at verse 7. Jesus said again to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep." Wow, that comes as a surprise. We would have expected him at this point to say something like, "I am the shepherd. I am the good shepherd." He doesn't say that. He'll say that in a few verses, yes. Instead, he utters the third of these formal I am statements in John's gospel. We've seen two already. Here's a third one. But instead of identifying with the shepherd in his illustration, he peculiarly and obscurely identifies with the door. He says, "I am the door." And it's by this, by the way, that I think it's evident that Jesus is not here in these next verses, 7 through 18 or 26, explaining the meaning or multiple meanings that he has inherent in the first story. No, you can see it's completely different now, because in the first story, it's not about the door. The story is not about the door, nor is it about the doorkeeper. The emphasis, by and large, in the first illustration here, the first 5 verses, is on the relationship between the shepherd and his sheep, and specifically, the identity of his sheep. How do you know the identity of his sheep? It's the ones who hear his voice. That is the question here. That is the issue in this first illustration. It's not necessarily about the legitimacy or the truthfulness of the shepherd or differentiating between true shepherds and false shepherds, though it does make that differentiation. The main point here is, who are the sheep? And the identity of his sheep, the true sheep, and by extension, the legitimacy and truthfulness of the true shepherd rests fully upon whether or not the sheep hear his voice and know it so well that they can distinguish it from the voice of strangers. That's the point here in the first part of the story. The main point, the primary point. And so the question is, it's not who is the true shepherd. The question is, who are his true sheep? It's about the sheep that he's now speaking to, some of which are a part of his fold, and many of which are not. And the question, who are his sheep? And its answer is singular. Those who are his sheep hear, know, and obey his voice. No, it's not the shepherds, but the sheep that are being tested here. It's not Jesus who is on trial. It is his audience, the Jews, the sheep. The sheep. And so he says to them, truly, truly, there's that solemn formula again for the 16th time. I say to you, I am the door. I am the door. Before you understand me as the good shepherd, first and foremost, I want you to understand one thing he's saying to them. I am the door. And the door, specifically, of the sheep. What exactly do you mean by door, Jesus? The door is the very thing that protects the sheep from those on the outside that would seek to enter and to do them harm, like the thieves and like the robbers in this analogy, or like a wolf, a vicious predator on the outside that would seek to devour them. So Jesus says, first and foremost, think of me as the door. I am the protector and I am the provider for the sheep. I alone provide safe passage for them into the safety of the fold at the end of the day, and I alone can provide access for them outside of the fold to nourish and to feed on the green pastures for sustenance. I am not only the primary or exclusive point of access to the sheep and for the sheep, but I'm also the only one who mediates any access to the sheep. No one else has the right to exercise care over the sheep, and no one else has the right to manage the sheep. It is I and I alone. I am the door. Nobody gets in and nobody gets out. And that's what he means by door. On the contrary, here's another contrast, verse 8. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. What is Jesus saying here? Are you saying that all of the Old Testament heroes and prophets, the messengers that God sent to minister to and to shepherd God's people, Israel in the Old Testament, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Moses, and the myriad more, are you saying they are all thieves and robbers? No, that is not at all what Jesus has in mind here. Primarily, he's referring to the messianic pretenders of his day who would come to his people And like wolves in sheep's clothing would promise them salvation, would promise them safety, would promise them provision, but lead them into nothing but slavery and death and suffering. It's those he has in mind. And by extension, the Pharisees and the religious leaders that are standing nearby, who by their own blindness, by their own greed, by their own jealousy of him, by their own political and religious and social pretexts, they are leading the sheep of Israel astray by their false interpretation of God's revelation in the Old Testament. They had the law, but they misinterpreted it, and they were misapplying it and lording it over and ruling and applying great burdens on the backs of people, the sheep of Israel. They were crushing them. It's these who he's talking about. And though he's not talking about Moses and Isaiah and Jeremiah and all the heroes of old, it's important to say that though they were faithful shepherds of Israel and proleptically pointed to the ultimate chief and great shepherd, Christ, they were insufficient as shepherds. Right? They could not fulfill that ultimate role of shepherd that only the promised Christ, the Messiah, Jesus, the eternal Son of God, was destined to fulfill. Absolutely and perfectly and unequivocally. He is the perfect fulfillment of all of the Old Testament imagery of the shepherd and God as shepherd, which you see permeated through the Old Testament scriptures. Like in Psalm 23. That's him. But as of yet, he's not identified himself with the shepherd in this long figure of speech and story, as he's now borrowing some elements from that first one, right? It's not a further explanation. He's talking about the door, and now he extrapolates upon that in verses 7 to 10. Then he's going to talk about the shepherd in verses 11 to 18 and build upon that metaphor. And then finally, he's going back to the sheep at the end of the story in verses 19 through 26. But he's just borrowing those themes. This is not a continuation or an explanation of the figure of speech in the first 5 verses. I am the door. And anyone else who comes and claims, especially thieves and robbers with malicious intent, they are all insufficient. None of them can fulfill the role of shepherd that God has ordained for me. And then he goes on to repeat himself. I am the door, verse 9. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and find pasture. He will be saved and find pasture. And so now he reiterates that I am statement, I am the door, but now he adds a new revelation to it. He says, I am the door, and not only will they be able to go in and out to find pasture in the rich foliage and to eat and to be refreshed and to be nourished and to grow and have sustenance for life and to come back into the fold. They'll have passage in and out, but he says they will be saved. They'll be saved. And so you can see now that the metaphor moves from the physical and literal imagery of shepherd and sheep to the spiritual eternal plane. He says, just as a shepherd lets his sheep go out safely and to graze and to find pasture during the day and brings them back into safety, saves them by bringing them inside these 4 walls at nighttime. In the same way, all who enter by me will be saved. But this is not unlike what he'll say later in John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. This is what he's saying here. I'm the door. The way is singular to salvation. I am the door. There is no other way for your provision, for your protection, for your safety and life. And more than that, he says, for the eternal salvation of your soul. For the eternal salvation of your soul. That's what I do as the shepherd, who is the door. But verse 10, on the other hand, the thief comes only to steal and to kill and to destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. He's saying, on the other hand, look at what the false shepherds and imposters and deceivers and thieves do. Not only do they come to steal, but you see that inherent in what he's saying is they're not just wanting to steal the flock or the sheep for themselves that they can raise and glean some of the benefits, eventually slaughter, have meat, have sacrifices for their own, have wool to keep them warm. No, it says they want to kill and destroy. They want to slaughter the sheep. The exact opposite of my intention. I came that my sheep might have life. And these shepherds, these so-called shepherds, are coming to slaughter you. We couldn't be more diametrically opposed in our goals and what we have to provide. I came that they may have life and to have it abundantly. This is not talking about different degrees of life, like having life is one degree and then an abundance of life in a different degree. He's not talking about it in that sense. He's talking about it more qualitatively. The kind of life that he brings is an abundant life, because it's not just the provision and the protection here and now, but it is eternal life. It is on a different plane and scale cosmically than any other shepherd could ever provide. Therefore, it is lavish, it is abundant, it is full. That's what he's saying here. The quality of life that I offer is unique. It's full. It's eternal. It's abundant. And as we walk away from these first 10 verses, and before we continue the rest next week, there's a few things that pop out for us. And the first of which is that a sheep is the most pride-crushing, humiliating creature to be likened to. Isn't it? It's pride-crushing. It's humbling. It's downright humiliating. Who wants to be compared to a sheep? What country? Can you imagine a country ever picking a sheep as their national symbol? There's a close second, probably Canada. They have the beaver. Who picks a beaver? Wow, that's intimidating. Right? Who would want a sheep? A sheep? Why can't I be a tiger? I want to be a lion, a cheetah, a bald eagle soaring, something majestic, something symbolizing power, something at the top of the food chain, a grizzly bear. Jesus says no. No. You're a sheep. You're a sheep. One of the dumbest, most easily terrified, least intelligent, and helpless creatures on the face of the planet. Have you heard some of the stories about sheep? They can literally be scared to death. If you come around too fast on the other side of the corner of the barn and surprise them, they are known to literally fall over in fear, collapse, have a heart attack, and die. They're scared to death. And they have the worst herd mentality instinct you could ever imagine. We think of lemmings all running off the cliff, right? There was a story some years ago in Istanbul, Turkey. It says 400 sheep fall off a cliff, but that's not at all what happened. No, sheep follow a leader, and the lead sheep ran off the cliff, and the other 399 ran after him. And not only that, the other 1,100 did too, but they survived because the first 400 broke their fall. That's a true story. They are always getting themselves into trouble, and they're always dying because of the dumbest things. If the ground is uneven and in their instability and high center of gravity imbalance, they can fall over and die, legs up in the air. If they get too fat and roll on their backs, they are unable to get back up, and they will die a slow and agonizing death right there with their legs in the air. They can't get back up. If they get a minor scratch on one of their legs or on their hoof, they get so terrified, they literally lose the will to live, and they give up and die right there. That's sheep. That's sheep. Sheep are totally dependent on their shepherd for their everyday basic protection and provision and everything else in between, or they will inevitably and invariably die. Without a shepherd, they are dead meat, literally. Wow. That's sheep. This is intentional here by Jesus. This is intentional. And it's intentional to teach you and I a lesson and to continually remind us of our total and utter dependence upon Jesus as our shepherd to guide us, to protect us, to provide for us, to secure us, to comfort us, and not only to protect and to provide us here, but to provide for us eternal life in himself as the good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep, guaranteeing and securing it for us forever. The question is, have you humbly embraced your identity as and similarity to and likeness with a sheep? Or do you still look in the mirror and see a lion? Because if you look in the mirror and see a lion, you can be sure that you're a lion. I just made that up right there. I thought that was pretty good, actually. Wow, what a pun. You can quote me on that. If you do see yourself as a sheep, the proof of that is that you will listen to the shepherd's voice. And that's point number 2. True sheep hear the shepherd's voice. True sheep hear the shepherd's voice. Are you with me? They hear only his voice. They follow only his voice. Him. They don't listen to the voice of other so-called shepherds. They don't recognize the voice of other shepherds. They don't follow the voice of other shepherds. They flee from them, from false shepherds, from their voice, from their words. Their message does not resonate with them. No, the only message that resonates, that is intelligible to them, is the one that is spoken to them by the true shepherd, and they will settle for no other shepherd, nor be deceived by any other shepherd's voice. They have ears that are finely tuned to the sound of the shepherd's voice. There is no tricking them, which means they know him, they know his voice, they've heard it, they've read it, they've believed it, they've studied it, and they are applying and living it every single day of their life, and could never and would never be tricked into following another false shepherd's voice. This is an impossibility, theologically speaking. They know that if they don't follow his voice, they will die. There's a story that a man tells as he's doing some business in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. He's there with another lawyer friend. They're about to leave. They have their ticket. And they're at the airport, and suddenly another man comes up to them. He says, "Hey, I got a plane. I'm a pilot. I flew it here. I'm flying it back to Anchorage. Why don't you return your tickets? Both of you can come with me. I got 2 seats, plenty of room. You can save yourself some money. The man says, I'm okay. We're good. Don't worry about it. The pilot insists, please. I can assure you it's perfectly safe. I have my license. I got many hours of flying experience under my belt. And against every ounce of better judgment, the man obliged. He says, okay. Go to the airport. Plane is ready. It's a nice, beautiful, shiny little plane. Seats 3 or 4. They get in the plane. They start taxiing to the runway. And the man says, should we pray? The pilot says, I don't typically pray. The man says, well, we're going to pray this time. And so they start praying. And he prays for an extended period of time as the fear is starting to surface, 5 or 8 minutes, until finally the plane starts to accelerate and it lifts off smoothly and gently into the Aleutian Island sky. Everything is fine, it's smooth, it's majestic. And they suddenly make their way into the clouds. And the pilot looks over to the man and he says, I got to tell you something. He says, I can't fly in the clouds. They make me pass out. And the man says, what? Did the clouds make you pass out? And then suddenly, out of nowhere, he begins to see the pilot's eyes roll back in his head, and he's mumbling a little bit, and he passes out cold. Shocked, he doesn't know what to think. He looks back at his friend. His friend says, what are we going to do? We're probably going to die. And he says, yeah, we're probably going to die. And as they're fumbling around, he passes the ear set, the radio to his friend. He says, call out to them. See if somebody's there to answer. And so he calls out. He says, hello, hello. They didn't know anything about proper radio etiquette until finally a voice on the other side of the radio then answers back and says, don't you know anything about good, proper radio etiquette? And they said, no, we don't know anything at all. We're on this plane. The pilot's passed out. We're going to die. We need help. And he says, okay, I'm flying a freighter from Anchorage to Tokyo, but I can reach out to Anchorage Emergency to see if they can maybe help save you. So I'm going to circle around you for a few minutes. Because if I don't circle around you, I'm going to lose you in radio, and you won't have anyone. So he circles around. And then finally, another voice comes on the other side of the radio. And he says, hello. We understand that your pilot's passed out. And the man says, yes. And we don't know how to fly this plane. We're stuck. He says, this is Anchorage Emergency. We're here to help you. My job is to get you safely home. But if I'm going to get you safely home, then you need to listen to me very carefully. You need to obey my voice. Everything that I tell you to do. Say, okay. The first thing that needs to happen is you need to give me a few minutes to find you. Because until I find you, I can't guide you. Say, okay. A few minutes passes, the voice returns on the radio. He says, okay, I've located you. And I got to tell you, in about 3 minutes, you're about to fly straight into this mountain ahead of you. You need to listen to my voice. The man thought to himself, of course I'm going to listen to the voice. Right? In that moment, how unreasonable would it be to not listen to the voice? Just listen to my voice. And the voice guides him over that mountain range. And as they continue making their flight all the way back to Anchorage, the voice comes on again. He says, I got bad news. There's a big storm brewing. A terrible storm. And unless you continue to carefully listen to and obey my voice, you're going to die. Keep your ears on my voice. Listen to my voice. Don't focus on the storm around you, because if you do, you're going to die. Listen to my voice. So the man listened to his voice. And they weathered the storm. And they begin to approach Anchorage Airport. And he says, this is going to be the hard part. This is going to be the hard part. But listen to my voice very carefully. I am going to light the way before you. And as you approach the airstrip, you're going to see some lights. And the lights are going to be in the sign of a cross. Follow that cross. The man says, okay. And finally, they approach the landing strip. And he can see the light of the cross before him. And he lands that plane. And they finally come to a halt. And the pilot wakes up. And the airport authorities, they check them into a local motel. And suddenly at 4 a.m, there's a knock on the door. The man opens the door. And the gentleman at the other side answers. And he says, hello. And immediately he recognizes the voice and says, you're the man that got me home. And he says, I am. And there's an important lesson here. And it is the importance of listening to the singular voice and call of God in His Son, Jesus Christ. There are so many voices in the world around you that would lead you astray, that would cause you to stumble, that would cause you to sin, that would lead you away from Christ, that would cause you to fear, to panic, to be uncertain in your circumstances, to be ungrateful, to distract you, to drown out the clear clarion call of God in His Son, Jesus Christ, who is trying to lead you home by the light of the cross. Listen to His voice and to His voice alone. And if you do, you can be sure that you truly are one of His sheep. And number 3, Jesus is the shepherd who not only His sheep know, but who knows His sheep, us, intimately and personally and individually before we even knew Him. In this illustration, it's an absurdity. It's an intentional exaggeration. No shepherd in His day knew all the sheep. Jesus is using that because He knows the reality to which it points in the imagery. It's Him as the good and chief shepherd and His intimate knowledge of and love for His own, His disciples, His sheep, whom He knows so well that He knows them personally and calls them by name. By name. Like Jeremiah 1:5 says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you and I consecrated you, which means set you apart. He knows you by name. And we're going to see more about this good shepherd who knows you by name and what He came to do for you, specifically your name, which was written in the Lamb's book of life before eternity began. The perfect fulfillment of all the Old Testament shepherding imagery. Right? The good shepherd of Psalm 23, it's Jesus. The shepherd that Moses prayed for, knowing his time to lead and to shepherd the people of Israel, was coming to an end in Numbers 27:15-17. He says, Lord, bring a shepherd to these people that they would not be like sheep without a shepherd. And the very next verse makes it clear that the successor is Joshua. But listen to this, whose name, not coincidentally, is from the same root in Hebrew, which in Greek is translated Jesus, but in Hebrew it's Yeshua, except Joshua has one extra vowel sound, Yeshua, Yehoshua. It's Jesus, who's always Jesus. In a rural school in Texas, a teacher asks his first grade students a question. He says, if there are 9 sheep in a pen and 1 sheep jumps out, how many sheep are left? All the class shouts out. They didn't even have time to raise their hands. 8! And when the noise dies down, one little boy raises his hand and says, "None of them are left." And the teacher laughs. "Son, you don't understand arithmetic, do you?" And the little boy replies, "Teacher, you don't understand sheep." And the little boy was right. Sheep are completely and utterly and totally dependent on their shepherd for direction, for protection, for provision, for salvation and life, just as we are on Jesus Christ. He is the good shepherd, and we are the sheep. And if and only if you obey his voice, can you be sure that you are a part of his eternal fold and are one of his sheep.